What's going on, everybody? I'm Byron, and you are now watching the Tell the Story Doc podcast on All of Life TV. We've had quite a few episodes now. We're rolling, y'all. I'm committed. I told y'all I'm committed to doing this. So every Friday, we're going to record a conversation, and I'm excited about today's conversation, just like I've been excited, but I'm extra excited today because we got Rich on here. I was about to pronounce your last name with some sort of accent, but I was gonna mess it up. So I ain't even gonna do that. But I'm just gonna say, y'all welcome Rich to the Tell the Story Doc podcast.
Hey man, I appreciate you, man. I appreciate you, the effort. But think of it and then stop yourself if you didn't think you was gonna do it right. But I appreciate that, bro.
Yeah, man. Look, I don't want to be. Have you ever been to a restaurant? Like a Mexican restaurant or something, or a Chinese restaurant, and somebody tries to pronounce something, you like, come on, bro.
I'm gonna be honest with you, but I ain't mad at it. I'm not the one to, get upset for someone trying. I think there's an appreciation for the effort that someone put in to make some level of connection with whatever culture they're experiencing at that moment. So I ain't mad at it. I'm not the one.
I get it. Listen, I try it. My sister is fluent in Spanish, so I talk to her, and sometimes we go out and I'll try some things, but then other times I'm like, yeah, I don't want to offend nobody.
Yeah. Well, it's also one thing to take the attempt and be super confident in it and perhaps even arrogant about it.
Yeah.
It's another thing to say, man, I'm going to tread lightly, but I'm going to still take the shot. I can appreciate the latter.
Man.
That's when you start like, all right, bro, you wilding for a second here.
Man. I'm trying to think. As you were talking, I'm trying to think. We had some food the other night, and there's an appetizer my wife gets all the time. I don't know why I'm drawing a blank on it right now, but she pronounces it so wrong. And every time we go to go get Mexican food, she says it. Oh, empanadas. She's like, "Can I get the empanadas?" And the people are like, "They're empanadas."
Empanadas. Yeah. Well, in Spanish, one of the more kind of pronounced sounds of Spanish that I think has become more commercial is the ñ, which is the N with the squiggly line over it.
Yeah.
That's demonstrably Spanish. So it don't matter what culture you're in, if you're if I could just say the ñ sound, then I'm remotely close to the culture. So you start throwing that ñ on words
everywhere.
that don't even have it. Yeah. So just let me get the empanadas. And I'm like, no, it doesn't have that N in there. So
man.
I appreciate it.
Hey, Rich, let me tell you something. And I kind of drop these bombs every podcast. This has sort of become my thing, right? So I want to let you know the first time we met. So this was, you probably don't even remember this. So I did some time in Memphis at Fellowship Memphis, and it might have been I might have been there for 7 days at this point. And this guy, he's sitting at his desk and he's on his cell phone. He's walking around, talking all loud and all of this. And he looks at me. He was like, "Yo, you want to talk to my friend Rich?" I was like, "Sure." I don't. Rich who? He's like, "Rich Perez." I was like, "Sure." And it's a dude named Javon Washington. He passes me the phone and he's like, "Yo, talk to him." I'm like, "Yo, what's up, man?" And you're like, "Yo, what's up?" And that was it. I was like, that was random. Why did you do that? And then, yeah, man. And then I think I saw you again at a conference. One of those conferences, I can't remember which one, man. It might have been Legacy or I don't know. There's a million of them that I feel like all of us cross paths at all of those. But I really got a chance to sit down with you and have a bit of conversation with you through Creek Collective recently, about a year ago in Chicago. And man, I just enjoyed sitting and hearing your story and getting to kind of see you just like as a man, and at that point you had already made a transition out of ministry, and man, you just look free, like you just look light and free and healthy, man. So we start always by making connection, but also giving an opportunity for those on the podcast to tell their story. So I don't know where their story starts for you. I don't know where you care to start this story. I've heard you tell stories about your life before. I've read your book, all of that. But man, share just a little bit about who Rich is.
Yeah. Well, dude, I appreciate that. Man, Javon's the ultimate connector. Um,
Ultimate.
I love that, dude. We don't get a ton of touch points, and only periodically do we kind of just stay in touch. But when we do reconnect, it's always love. So that sounds like a very Javon thing to do. But
Yeah.
yeah, man. I mean, I've always said a few things are have been very formative in my life, and they've all come from different moments in my life. Intersection, family, among those things. And so I'll kind of just start there. My parents are immigrants. And that's probably, I start there because I think that that has been significantly formative to who I am today. Although I am not an immigrant, I was in the world of the immigrant by virtue of my parents, of course, my aunts and cousins, and my older sister, who is an immigrant, came here when she was about 6 years old. But I grew up in the inner city of New York, so basketball culture, hip hop culture was a significant part of my upbringing. Um, but also speaking Spanish and, like I said, immigrant culture. I grew up in a neighborhood called Washington Heights in the northern part of Manhattan, just below the Bronx. So we were in Manhattan, but we were closer in culture to the Bronx, kind of immigrant black and brown community than we were to Center City, Manhattan, which is, the Tim Kellers, the kind of middle upper class part of Manhattan. So while we were on the island, we were much closer to kind of like a inner city, lower immigrant community culture. So I grew up listening to Jay-Z, Nas, Big L. For those of you that are from New York, Big L was a huge influence. Playing basketball, but I also grew up in a home where I spoke Spanish. I ate Spanish food. I listened to Spanish music. I was immersed in Caribbean, particularly Caribbean Hispanic, which is interesting, and maybe we might get to that later. But there's a huge difference between kind of Latino culture if you're from Central South America, or Latino culture if you're from the Caribbean. Um, Massive difference, and I think I've realized that even more so living in Atlanta. Uh, so I kind of grew up in these two worlds, where throughout the day I was with my homies, speaking English, slang, eating cheeseburgers, pizzas, French fries, listening to Jay Z, Biggie, Big L. But at home it was speaking Spanish, Juan Luis Guerra, salsa, merengue, arroz con habichuela, aguacate, plátanos, like all that stuff, and immersed in that world. And for a very long time, I saw that as, okay, I got to take this hat off, put this hat on. I got to take this face off, put this face on. And for most of my upbringing, I served as a cultural translator to my parents, who in their countries were, you know, professionals in all sense of that word. They had careers, they went to school, but here in the States, they were back to square one. They did odd jobs. My dad was a porter and a valet driver for many years, and that's what he retired of. And my mom was a home attendant for many years, and then went to school, got her degree, and was a teacher before she passed away. But for a very long time, I served as this like mediator between what they knew and the world of the States and English. And anytime someone would call the crib speaking English, I mean, immediately my parents would be like, yo, you need to speak on the to this person on the other line and help us understand what's happening. Or mail, I'd have to be the translator. I told my mom all the time, I said that degree is also mine because I helped my mom with her homework as she navigated through her degree. So I say that for a very long time, you know, I saw that as a obstacle. Like I had to navigate these two worlds, and I wanted to just be part of one. Culturally, socially, I realized that I wasn't fully one thing. In America, as a black and brown person, you realize you're not fully American in the
Mm.
ways that perhaps you're, you know, more privileged, whether that's economically privileged or racially privileged, you know, counterparts are. But in my parents' home country, I also wasn't like them. I wasn't a native. I was this in between thing, this ambiguous thing.
Mm.
And for a long time, that felt like an obstacle until later in my life, I started to see it as an asset. A lot of things happened to help me embrace that kind of ambiguity and duality of living between two worlds and kind of creating my own. I think sports was one of them. Sports, I played baseball in high school, I played college and basketball. My faith was trying to find itself. I mean, we had grown up nominally Catholic. My mom came to faith in Jesus. I mean, she had an understanding of Jesus. I would even argue that she had some kind of faith in Jesus as a Catholic. Uh, but when she came to faith at a Protestant church, her behaviors in her life just started to look a little different.
Mm.
It felt less like routine, and more relational. There was a kind of a vibrancy to the way that she lived her life, coming to faith at a Protestant church, that perhaps we didn't necessarily see as practicing Catholics.
Mm.
And I was about 11 at that time, so church was kind of part of my life for a very long time. It has been, but the faith wasn't mine until I was about 15.
Mm.
Sitting at a service, gave myself to the Lord, and knew that I wanted my faith in God to influence the way that I was going to live, not the way that I lived as a Catholic. Like if I did these things or if I practiced these traditions, I'm straight. But my faith didn't really have an impact on the decisions I was making, on the value system that I operated out of. Whereas at 15, I was like, man, I really want what I believe in God and in the world to influence the way that I exist in the world. And that started to shift when I was about 15, 16. But you know, I'm still in high school. I'm
Mhm.
navigating my years. I went away to
In New
college
York, by the way.
in
So
New
that
York. Yeah, in New York. So, you know, there's so much deep culture, which is beautiful, but I think the challenge of New York wasn't that New York was like this inherently dark place,
Mhm.
any different than any other place in the world. I just think that the challenge of New York was not just the density of people, but the density of things to consume.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like you can very easily just go from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And some of those things can be really good and really beautiful. It's just the sheer amount of things that are there to capture your attention. It's really hard to, as a teenager, try to figure out which to settle in and how does my faith play a part in the way that I think about girls,
Mm.
sports, school culture, the block. Like it was just like, I don't have the capacity at 15 to think about all of this and then to try to just make space for my faith to influence. Anyways, I went to college, played ball, really struggled with my faith and how to bring it into like basketball culture, locker room kind of culture. I struggled my way through that. At 19, and this will be the last thing and we can pivot. At 19, I joined this group that was a traveling performing arts group that took the mediums of theater and music to share the faith. It was called Truce Ministries, Truce. My boy Alex Medina was a part of that. And then Andy, of course, Andy Minio was a part of that. We all met in college early. Alex and I were on our way out. Andy was on his way into the school. We became really good friends. And we traveled with this group. David Ham was the executive director. He's been one of my mentors and friends for a very long time. Um, and I was in that group until I was about 25.
Hmm.
So for about 6 years, we traveled internationally, we traveled domestically, and it was one of the most beautiful, life-giving times of my spiritual formation, friendship. And that started to begin to give me language and courage for what I think I wanted to do in the next season of my life.
Mhm.
Between that, I got married, had my first child, moved, lost my mom. A lot of things happened there, so there's a lot of details that we could pick at. But child of an immigrant, New York City, inner city culture, sports, faith, cultural translator, all of those were kind of pillars along the way that shaped the way that would eventually shape the way that I see my faith, see the world, and understand my role within it.
Man, that's awesome, bro. Yeah, there are pieces of that I think I'd heard before. It's always good to hear it again. Um, the first thing that kind of like stuck out to me is like, man, that dynamic that you describe of living, feeling like you're living in two different worlds as a child. Um, I can only imagine how, and I know like there was a redemptive aspect to it, but I can only imagine how challenging that was at certain periods. And you expressed that fairly clearly. But in my mind, I'm thinking like, man, that's something I've never had to do that. Right. And that is, in a sense, humbling and challenging to me as well, because I can only imagine what that was like.
Yeah.
And then also, to emphasize like, um, in that environment in New York City and in your neighborhood, like you express it very well. It's so rich in culture, like, and identity is almost um, imprinted on you really early, especially in neighborhoods like the one you grew up
Mm,
in, right?
yeah.
Because you very quickly get to see, hey, I'm this, right? Like even with the complexity of feeling like you're living in two worlds, I imagine that very early you're like, oh, I'm this. This is kind of how I fit into the puzzle, right?
Right.
And then the last thing that like really stuck out to me, and I remember when I heard you say this in Chicago about the group that you're a part of, the first thing that came to my mind was like, you remember like those gospel weightlifter dudes, like who used to like go on tour? Have you ever seen that or heard of that?
So, nah.
Okay, it's like in the charismatic circle, but like in the '90s, there was like these like dudes who they were weightlifters, like power lifters. I
Okay.
forgot what they're called, like gospel lifters or something like that. And I remember when you were telling me like you were in a, huh?
Burden carriers.
I don't
I
even
mean,
know.
I don't know. I'm just being silly.
But like the first time you expressed like, yo, I was in a traveling like troupe or group, I was like, yo, like the gospel lifters, but it wasn't anything like that. It wasn't
Like a
anything
Mickey
like
Mouse club, Mickey a 700 club, but
that. Yeah.
some crazy
Yeah,
stuff.
actually, that's a really good comparison because y'all were like, you get out like from the outside looking in, I see Andy Mineo, like, and most people who watch this podcast probably know
Sure,
of Andy and what the
sure.
Lord's helped him produce in his life and what he's been able to produce just off of God's gifting.
Yeah,
And Alex Medina, like, he's one of the most creative people, successfully creative people that
works for LeBron's company. I mean, he's
yeah.
done some incredible stuff. Yeah,
I mean, and then I mean, you're not a scrub. You know what I'm saying? Like, you,
I,
you're very talented and artistic as well. And my question is like, when you describe yourself as a younger age, in the 2 or 3 times I've heard you talk about this, I always hear you talk about sports, kind of culture, and then you move into almost like this artistic phase because you're
Yeah,
with this traveling group, and the gospel is at the center of it all, but it's really art, right?
yeah,
Do
yeah.
you feel like there was a transition into you becoming an artist, or have you always had like that artistic wing to you?
Yeah, it's interesting. My daughter, who's 11, asked my wife and I this a few nights ago. She was like, "Yo, what did y'all want to be when y'all were my age?" And without hesitation, I said, "Oh, I want to be a cartoonist. Like
Hmm.
that's what I wanted to be when I was young. I wanted to be a cartoonist." And oftentimes I spent my days at her age drawing away, looking at my family, and like as they had family gatherings, just looking at them and drawing them, making cartoon figures of them. I didn't keep that discipline. So, if I were to draw right now, it looked like what I used to draw when I was 11. Like I just
Mhm.
didn't develop that craft. But I say that to say I'll be 40 in a few months. And I think in retrospect, I'm realizing that I have always seen the world through the lens of how can I create what I imagine in my head.
Mhm.
Like I have particular ways of seeing the world, envisioning my place in the universe, so to speak, that's influenced by the way that I understand God and Jesus. How can I create that?
Mhm.
And not to use this word in any kind of quirky way, but how can I manifest that? How can my behaviors engage in such a way that creates that in the world? So when you ask me, did I think I had a shift? Yeah, in those moments, I think that I was shifting.
Mhm.
But I think now in retrospect, I'm realizing I wasn't shifting a way of being. I wasn't even shifting purpose. I think I was shifting expressions. That
Mhm.
I think that my role has always been to be a very creative minded person. And what I mean by that, not to speak vaguely, is as I mentioned before, to enact in as much as I am able to what I envision through a variety of means and expressions.
Mhm.
And I think that when I was a pastor for 20 years in total, 15 years, 12, 13 years with the church that we planted, I was expressing my creativity in a particular way.
Wow.
Uh, and then transitioning now into what I do as a filmmaker, I am still living out the calling that I felt when I got called the church plant.
Mhm.
I'm just shifting the expression. I am vocationally not a pastor. We can get into that.
Yeah.
But I am still exercising the gifts and kind of internal motivations that God has placed in me when He first called me to be a pastor. I'm just expressing that differently as a filmmaker.
Mhm.
And I think that I've had to do the work to find that through line, find the language for that stuff. But to answer your question, yes, I was shifting, but I realize now that I was just shifting circumstances and roles,
Mhm.
but not shifting in purpose and disposition. I think that I mean, like I said, wanting to like watch people, observe people, and recreate them in drawings to being in the sports world, having a radio show in my college,
Mhm.
uh, traveling and doing theater, uh, doing music, planting a church, preaching, um, counseling. I think now, and then now ultimately filmmaking. I think now all of those things require imagination.
For sure.
I didn't realize that I was tapping into creativity as I was doing all those things, particularly pastoring, because you don't necessarily think that pastoring is a creative endeavor.
Mhm.
More administratively. Maybe there are small aspects of your job as a pastor that feel like they require creativity or even imagination, but you need to be logistically minded. You need to be administratively minded. And we very seldom see those things as creative work. So
Hmm.
I don't know. Hopefully that gives some clarity to what
It
you're
really
asking.
does. It really does, man. A lot of the questions I ask are a little bit loaded and a little bit selfish.
No, you
Um,
good.
but I, I ask these questions because one, I can relate.
Mm,
Um, and I think sometimes I ask myself some of these questions, and to see a brother who is a few steps ahead, express those things in those ways, they help. And then even when I hear you tell your story, this is, um, I may not be a really good listener as I'm about to express this, but um, some people listen, and as they listen, they're zeroing in
mm,
only on the story of the person speaking. When I listen, I am listening with a level of making connection, right? So it's like, oh
mm,
man, I can
mhm,
relate to that. Oh man, I can relate to that. Oh, that's not a comparison thing. That's a contrast thing, right? Um,
mm.
so as you talk through that, it kind of helps me understand not just you, but a little bit about myself as well. You touched on this briefly, and man, this podcast is kind of geared toward pastors and church planners and church leaders.
Sure.
And you did plant a church. You're a pastor. Like
Yeah.
you said it, like you're not vocationally a pastor. I believe God called you to be a pastor. I believe in
Yeah.
some ways you're still pastoring people. But let's talk a little bit about that time that you were doing that vocationally. How did you like end up becoming a pastor?
Yeah. So um came to faith at 15. Spent a lot of time in my local church, which was again a I don't think I said this before, but it was a Spanish speaking immigrant church in the heart of my neighborhood. So even more so kind of immersed in immigrant culture, even in my spiritual formation. A lot of my formation was all in Spanish, but not just the language, because that feels superficial to some degree, but in the ways of thinking and processing. I was invested in by immigrants. And so the way that they saw the world and their faith was through that lens. Um, and then when I was around 18, I started, all of this is also influenced by the fact that I was an athlete. So I
Mhm.
played baseball in high school, basketball as a point guard, which is what I played. You kind of have to have leadership qualities. You're kind of a floor general. You're in control of the court, you're trying to guide people. And so I think I naturally had leadership uh qualities. And I wanted to know how I could implement my leadership leanings within the church. So I started to serve as a youth leader within my church. I started to do small things, small little speaking, small little group settings, all of which were very, very valuable to my formation. Um, and then I don't know, man, at some point when I was about that age, 18, early 19, I felt really compelled, like, yo, is pastoring something that I need to be considering?
Mhm.
Like, and I want to say that it was a very spiritual thing. Like the Lord placed it in my heart. I felt compelled. Yes, there was a part of it that was that, but it was also practical. Like I don't think I saw any other way to be a leader. So if you wanted to pursue leadership, the only practical way of pursuing that was like pastor. Oh, maybe I need to just be a pastor. So there was a spiritual kind of like motivation, but there was also a practical kind of like outworking of that. It's like, I guess I just need to be a pastor. So I just explored that, sat with my pastors and leaders. And then not too long after that, I joined this group. And so here I am kind of doing small things practically at my church, but then I joined this group. I think I'm among the oldest within the group at the time. Everybody was probably like 17, 18. I'm 19, 20. And the executive director, Dave Ham, puts a lot of trust in me as part of that group. So we would do these things. We would essentially do street concerts. So
Mhm.
we would go to places like Milwaukee, and this was like early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s. These inner cities were like hood, hood, hood. So we would go to places like Milwaukee, certain parts of Cali, certain parts of Florida, certain parts of New York, the Bronx, Brooklyn, and we would do these things, which in retrospect I realize are terrible names. They were called hit and runs. And essentially what we would do is we would have a sound system set up with linoleum floors,
Mm-hmm.
and we would have guys breakdancing. We would have music instrumentals playing, and myself, Alex, Andy, another dude named Keith, who was, man, this dude was nasty. We would just get on the mic in the middle of a projects complex, and we would just start freestyling,
Yeah.
and we would just go at it, kind of pass the mic to one another, and it would generate a crowd. And when we saw that the crowd had formed, sometimes hundreds of people, that's when we would start our show, and we would do our music set. And then at the very end, we would do, what we would consider historically a gospel presentation. And most of the times I was the one leading that, the executive director, Dave Ham, who was, maybe at that point, 10 years older than me, he would be at the forefront of all of it. But whenever he wanted to have one of the, members lead, it was either myself or Alex or Keith, who were among the older ones. And we did that domestically, internationally, and we did that for many years. And I think that experience really started to feed my desire to be a pastor and be out front. And there was a sense in that I realized that my leadership was also a kind of theater. And I don't mean that superficially. I mean, like, every week you get up and you preach. There is a certain aspect of your work that is theater, not in that you're putting on a show, but that in you are concerned about presentation. You know what I mean? Whether it's your sermon, whether it's the worship gathering, not overly obsessed, but like, you think about liturgy.
Mm-hmm.
So, anyways, fast forward, I get married. My wife and I move upstate. We do 3 years at a Bible school. We come back. I say, I want to go back to my neighborhood and I want to plant a church. And that's exactly what we did. I worked as a teacher while I fundraised. Within the year and a half, I raised money to transition full time into it. We planted in 2011. We led the church 2010. We led the church for a decade. And it was probably one of the most beautiful, difficult, exhausting, invigorating work that we've ever done.
Mm-hmm.
Planted in the neighborhood, a block away from where I grew up and a block away from where I lived. And we did church in that radius, in that kind of half mile radius for 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
Anyways, yeah.
I love it. I love it, man. Yeah. So by the time I had started kind of walking into ministry, y'all had been rolling for quite some time, but I can attest to the fact that you have been a storyteller for as long as I've known of you, right? Like you can tell there are certain guys when they preach, the information is what you get most from them. And then there are other guys that it's almost as if they're like spilling all of themselves out, and not like in a invasion of privacy type way, but
Sure.
in a holistic way. Like and they're telling stories as they are preaching and leading and doing certain projects or ministries. And that's what I've always seen from you, especially as you led CCF. Um, my question, to get to the next question, um, one of the things that always stood out to me was when I looked at Rich from New York, I was like, man, this dude loves his neighborhood a lot,
Mhm.
right? And there are guys planting all over. Like you hit right before kind of going into this church planting boom, right? Especially for Black and Brown brothers.
Yeah.
Um, but so many guys were going to the hardest city they could find or going to the most racially divided place in America or wherever the money led them or you know what I mean? And you're like, bro, I just want people in my neighborhood to know Jesus. And
Yeah.
that was extremely encouraging to me. What are you one of those people who is like the only place I would have planted was the place I knew the most, the place I loved the most?
That's a good question. I was gonna answer that fairly quick because I thought I knew the answer, but I wanted to give it a little bit more thought. I think so.
Hmm.
I don't think that I would have wanted to plant anywhere else. Yeah, I think so because there's some parallel with filmmaking here, if I could. Um, I recently did worked on my own film, wrote it, worked on it, really dope production. And then immediately after, someone handed me a script, said, "Hey, could you direct this? We'd love for you to
Hmm.
direct this." I sat with the script. I wasn't like in love with what I read, but there was enough for me to say, "All right, let me work with this if the writer gives me enough freedom to kind of go in and make some changes, add some stuff that I think is missing, remove some things that I think are unnecessary." Eventually, I ended up doing it, but I felt different to the content. I felt
Hmm.
the relationship was very different. I was excited to do this other script, but it was different when I did my script.
Yeah.
I don't think that I would have had the same enthusiasm planting and in another city as I did planting in my neighborhood. And I think the reason is I was not driven in planting the church. I was not driven by the idea of starting something or planting something. Maybe there was a little bit of like the juice that was being passed around was church planting, and maybe I drank a little bit of it, but I wasn't motivated by that. I was motivated by place.
Hmm.
And that place was dear and special to me because it was the place that shaped so much of who I am that I wanted to contribute
Yeah.
something to that space, that when another kid grows up in that space and has a similar story to mine, that my contribution is also part of their formation.
Hmm.
And so CCF for me, Christ Crucified Fellowship, by the way, CCF for me was a matter of place and a matter of formation. So could I have planted with the same kind of vigor and enthusiasm in a city that I didn't have that connection to? I doubt it.
Yeah.
I don't think I could have sustained the work of church planning, leading people, investing in people, forming people, or being a tool in their formation is such demanding work mentally, psychologically, emotionally, physically, and of course, spiritually. I could not have given that kind of investment to a place that I just didn't feel connected to.
Hmm.
It just would have been too difficult for me. I wouldn't have sustained the work. So the short answer is no. I don't think I could have planted anywhere else. And I think even as I say this out loud, maybe my contribution to the kingdom of God as a pastor and as a church leader was solely for the community that had done so much for me,
Yeah.
which is
I love that.
probably why I transitioned. I don't know.
Yeah. Man, I am I'm good. I suspected that I knew the answer to that question. I'm glad that I was in line with what
Yeah.
you answered. So I'm only a few years into church planting and all of that stuff, but I am a firm believer in the idea of um someone having a almost unbreakable connection to place, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I think far too often we believe that we just go anywhere, like the whole hey, the Matthew 28 says go, right? We gotta go. It's like, yeah, Yeah, but it could be go across the street, right? Like it could be like go down the block, right? It
Mhm.
doesn't always have to be pick up and go somewhere else. So as I'm talking to church planners, that's what I'm always trying to identify. And I kind of use you as a marker in a sense of like, man, do you love, like, do you actually love this place and the people who are there? Or are you just trying to see conversions and a new church being built so that, something else can
Yeah.
happen?
Yeah,
And
if I could interject a little bit on that thought, I think what you're saying is so important, and to miss what you're saying, I think gives birth to colonizing,
Mm,
because part of the reason that I felt compelled to stay or to go to my neighborhood, something that was familiar, was not because I thought something was wrong with my neighborhood,
mhm.
but because I thought that there were things in my neighborhood that were beautiful, and I wanted to connect that beauty to something,
Yeah.
something more meaningful, something uh, not more meaningful, but something more anchored. Like there was so much beauty in my neighborhood, and particularly coming from like immigrant culture, that I'm like, yo, there's something about your narrative in this context as an immigrant that I think really resonates with the truth about God and Jesus. And I wanted to be the entity and the people that helped make that connection. I wasn't trying to go to my neighborhood to save it. I was trying to go to my neighborhood to connect it. And I
Yeah.
think that if you can't see the beauty in a place, you will be tempted to only or predominantly see the dark of a place and always feel like the savior of the
Mm,
place or the messiah or the place or the fixer of a place. And you'll miss out on the connections that you can make with that place, with that people, to the truth about God. Often people start with Genesis 3 when they should often start with Genesis 1, the beauty
right.
of creation, the beauty of people. And of course, we understand, for those on this side of the conversation, we understand the fall, we understand sin, we understand darkness, we understand the brokenness and the marred image. We understand that. But I think that we often fail to start or understand the inherent beauty and meaningfulness of God's creation. And that really influences the way that we go to a place. So I say all that to say, if you miss that, you go to a place with the purpose of fixing a place, saving a place. And I think that's what colonizers do.
Mm,
Colonizers go to places to try to fix something. Colonizers go to a place because they think that they have the upper hand on wherever it is that they're going. And we see this in a myriad of ways play itself out, right? Whether it's something like urban development, gentrification, the way that cultures and races interact with each other in a particular urban space, the way that Christians do missions. Like we run the risk of doing missions from the lens of our cultural interpretation of the gospel of Jesus.
mhm.
And we totally miss that there's an entire culture that already exists there. And we miss that God might be up to something without you.
Right.
Like you you know, Justo Gonzalez, Cuban American pastor, said this to me. He's here in Atlanta, and I've had the privilege and honor to like connect with him a lot more since I've been here. He said this to me. He's like, Rich, I think he asked me where how does the commission, the gospel commission start in Matthew? You know, you just mentioned it. And I said, oh,
Mhm.
go ye therefore and make disciples. He's like, that's not how it starts. I said, yeah, yeah, we go to the Bible, and I say, yeah, look, therefore go ye. He said, oh, wait. He said, therefore. It starts with therefore.
Mhm.
And part of what he highlighted in that conversation is, okay, obviously you've got to go back. What's the therefore? And the previous verses talk about Jesus saying, all authority has been given unto me, right? And what he goes on to share with me really helped to frame some paradigms for me. He was like, all authority is given to Jesus. And Jesus has already sent his spirit to begin work all over the world, sometimes with you, other times without you. Before you go somewhere and try to bring what you think is what this community needs or this place needs, the baptizing them or, discipling all nations, why don't you first ask, where has the authority of Jesus already been at work in this place?
I love it.
And then go into that place and discover what God is up to. And more than often, what you'll find is that God has already been at work without you. And usually through cultures and people that are very different than yours.
Right.
So that when you go in, you don't go in with your cultural, rubrics of how this thing should be done, but instead you should prayerfully be discerning where has God been at work in this place? And let me insert myself humbly, quietly insert myself into this place to faithfully exist among this people, if it's not your place. But I just think it influences the way that we go.
Yeah. I love that. There's a culture of colonization in church planting that
yeah.
Man, I pray that God removes that. There was a brother who texted me recently. He wanted to see my prospectus. I was like, man, I'll never see this. I'll never see this, because we are literally trained to like focus only on the depravity and our vision, right? Like my vision and God's, and really is like when we write it down, is a little bit like a sprinkle of the Holy Spirit, and our vision is going to be the thing that penetrates the depravity in our area. And you're right. Many of us don't spend the time to identify the beautiful things that are already there, the places where God is already working. And the advantage that you had, and many brothers who plant, especially in places that they were either born in, raised in, or lived in for a long amount of time before planting, is that you are already acquainted with a lot of those beautiful spaces. It's just, if you have not interpreted them as good spaces or beautiful spaces, it's that period of your eyes being open to those things. But more often than not, you already have that feeling, right? Like you already kind of know that this is a good thing, right? Let me ask. I don't know a guy who loves his neighborhood more than you, loves the culture that you came out of more than you, and that poured as much into his church. That's arguable, but why would you leave? Like, why would you walk away from that?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is, a multi-layer. It's a simple question with a very complex answer, or a multi-layered answer. The first thing I'll say is it was incredibly difficult leaving, like incredibly difficult for those reasons. I'm 39. I have spent a cumulative of about 33 years of my life, not just in New York, in that neighborhood. You know what I mean? New York is a very big city, but I've spent 33 years of my 39-year-old life within that neighborhood, being shaped and formed by all the things that came out of those seasons of life, but also that place. Planted the church there. So leaving was incredibly difficult. It wasn't a very easy decision. But why? The first thing I'll say outside of it being difficult was I realized one of the motivating factor was realizing that I had a choice on how I wanted to build legacy
Hmm.
and leave an imprint. We got to a juncture in our leadership as pastors of the church, planting the church, leading the church, where I could stay, kind of press through some of the hardships that we experienced in 2020. Stay, press through, or leave. I felt very compelled, and I think I've said this I said this to the church over the course of many years. My biggest opportunity to leave a mark for the glory of God and the kingdom that He's establishing is by loving my wife and my kids. I think my most sacred prayer is loving my wife and doting over my kids.
Mhm.
Like if I can be present to them in the most present, most vulnerable, honest, authentic way, um, I think that I've done a faithful job. And I think that that is, I believe still that that is the most impactful way that I can demonstrate the kingdom of God, by being faithful to my wife and loving my kids and being present with them and all that that means, formation, discipleship. I felt like practically I was coming to a place where my energies, practically, I was not able to sustain both. And I had a choice. Do I continue to do this? And there's some practical things to this too, like help, leadership, structure that perhaps weren't in place that I could have had in place to make this easier. Um, do I stay and kind of like spread my energies to the church and my family? Or do I leave faithfully, process this well with my leadership, and transition to whatever God had next, which at that point I wasn't entirely clear, and just be present with my family in unhindered ways. You know this as a pastor, no matter how good you are at protecting your time and setting up boundaries, mentally, emotionally, psychologically, it's still a challenge. And that it's a noble challenge. I was confronted with the question, is it okay if I gave this up and just focused on being with my family and processing what could be next? Obviously, I made the decision that yeah, it was okay.
Yeah.
But that influenced the way that I thought about legacy. Somebody recently, a homie of mine came from New York and asked me, it's like, yo, everybody wants to know why'd you leave? Or at least everybody, and by everybody, I mean like the people that weren't in my immediate circle, because also not everybody needs to know why.
Right.
Like, and I'm okay with that. But the people that needed to know, I gave reasons and we processed that together and I got to live with them. Um, I said legacy. I was confronted with the question when we left the church and eventually closed, because we didn't just leave the church, but we also closed the church,
Right.
which is its own dynamic. I did not want to close the church. I made 4 decisions in the summer of 2020. I'm not going to be the lead pastor of this church. I'm not going to pastor anymore. We're going to leave New York. We're going to close the church. All those 4 decisions happened summer, fall of 2020. One decision led to the next. They did not happen all at once. They kind of influenced each other. The very last one about closing the church was hard. I did not want to do that. We had pandemic. We had kind of leadership structure that just couldn't sustain my leaving. And so we made a practical decision to close the church. But the Lord used that honestly to kind of reshape the way that I thought about church in general and influence and legacy. I had the choice. One of the things I was confronted with during that time was, how will I be remembered and the impact that we did here for the labor that we offered for the last 10 years? And I said, we need to keep the church open. Otherwise, how will people know that we did anything here?
Mm.
And I was really confronted by that, man. And the more I pressed into that thought, the more my ego was the one driving it.
Yeah.
I need to leave this church open so that if anybody comes across this church, anybody comes across this neighborhood, and they see this church and it's doing well, they could always say, "Oh, that was Rich. Who did that?" Or even if they say the Lord used Rich to do that, it would still always just go back to me. And the more I leaned into that, the more I was confronted with my ego, and the more I felt soft to say, "Oh, okay, I'm okay if this closes."
Hmm.
Um, we did the best that we could over the course of several months to help transition people. We didn't just close the church, but we made sure to connect our people to churches and networks that we had built over the course of a decade, deep relationships with, and say, "Hey, you won't have us as a local church anymore. These are the churches that you have seen their preachers come and preach here. They have invested time. We have invested time with these communities. Like, you can still be the church outside of CCF." And that was such a hard concept because we built something really dope, man. 90% of the people that went to our church lived in that 1 mile radius. People did life together. They ate dinners together. They invested time in each other and their kids. They were the ones at the town hall meetings. They were the ones fighting for affordable housing. They were the ones feeding people with food insecurity. We built something really dope, and the Lord really, really breathed on that work. So closing it felt really hard. But because we spent a decade of investment planting roots, being with our people, closing the church was fine because we were closing the doors of an institution, but we weren't erasing what God did for 10 years. And people
Mhm.
continued to be the church, influenced by CCF and the culture and DNA that we built. And now they've gone to different churches and brought that DNA with them. And I'm hoping that CCF lives through these other communities in the people that went there. And I think that that gives me a lot of comfort. Um, but I had a hard time because I was the one that wrote the book.
Mhm.
I wrote the book about staying.
Right.
And so I don't know that I have specifically to that aspect of the question. I don't know that I have a kind of like stable answer. I just think that the what God did to me throughout the course of my 33 years in that neighborhood, be it the immersion of immigrant culture, inner city, sports, hip hop, faith, CCF, that place, despite the fact that I'm no longer there and I haven't been for the last 3 years, remains with me.
Yeah.
That place is still a part of who I am, and that I've brought that place with me and all that it's done to me to in this new place, Atlanta. And that now I've taken the experiences of being in that neighborhood, the nuances of existing in that neighborhood, and I'm bringing those learnings and the way that I've been shaped by that. I could never erase that place. Never.
Mhm.
Whether I'm there or not, I could never erase what that place did to me. I could never erase how that place shaped me. In fact, Uptown, for all intents and purposes, follows me where I go.
Mm.
And I think I bring aspects of that place with me. And what particularly what God did to me through that place and those people. Um, it remains with me. And so I think that was a kind of comfort as I
Yeah.
physically left the place. It was a kind of comfort to me to know that how the Lord shaped me during those decades, and particularly that decade of pastoring and planting and creating culture and DNA and passing that to other people, and people bought the vision. Um, it's a comfort to me to know that I still have that place with me, and bringing it here. But also, I'm asking the question now, like, okay, how does Atlanta shape me?
Mhm.
Um, it's tough. It's tough. It's a grief, for
Yeah.
sure. It's a moment of grief. It's moments of grief, knowing that I'm no longer in that place. Um, but the place is still with me.
Yeah.
So
Man, so much there. So much there. Couple things jump out at me. Um, before I kind of jump to those words that I'm seeing words, but um, I think it's probably the only way that things could have happened. You know, when you when a person like you gives as much of themselves to something
Mhm.
as you did, not in effort, oh, not to say you didn't work, but not because you were trying to prove something, but because it was an overflow of who you are. A lot of times that's how the story has to end, right? And it's because
Yeah.
you you planted off of your love for people in a community in a place, right? Not you didn't like strive to build a system or like strive to build like this new big thing that will last forever. Like what you were doing was creating space in a place that you loved.
Mhm.
And it kind of points me back to that artistic thing, man. Like you are a true artist, right? Because we all have these things that creatives and artists, right? That it's our one thing that we invest so much into and we're constantly tweaking. It's our one masterpiece, and maybe that's the wrong word, but it's the one thing that kind of draws our heart.
Yeah.
And then eventually we say like, hey, I have to like separate myself from this thing,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of different reasons why that could happen. For you,
Sure.
it was this reflection on legacy and time and this understanding that I only have a certain amount of time. And
That's right.
I think anybody who knows you or has at least met you knows how much you care about your children and
Mhm.
your wife. Right. So when you're like framing this thing out and talking about legacy, how important it is for you to leave a legacy and CCF be a part of that. Now I can see that shift in seeing you interact with your son. I've only seen you interact with your son uh,
Yeah, yeah.
in in person, but also hearing you talk about your wife and your daughter as well. Man, that is like you are painting a picture for people to see this same message that people have preached over and over and over. Like I've seen far too
Mhm.
many preachers get to 70 years old and say, "Hey, you should probably spend more time with your children." And like you at 37 or whatever are like painting that picture in real time for some of your peers to see and some people who are right behind you to see. So,
Yeah.
thank you for that. I can only imagine how difficult that transition was, but what makes it sweeter in its
Yeah.
bitter moments is the fact that you're doing it for a great reason, which is like so you can give more of yourself to your children and your wife and your as the cliche saying your first ministry, right?
Oh,
um
sure. I mean, it's a cliche for a reason
yeah.
because um you think oftentimes, particularly in the New Testament, of what can often disqualify a leader. And you see it all throughout the New Testament. Of course, there's other things, but you realize that oftentimes one of the main sources of disqualification is your relationship to your family
Yep.
and how healthy or not healthy it is. Your prayers are hindered by virtue of your not living in an understanding way with your wife. You are cautioned in the New Testament to not provoke your children. And I think all of that holistically is to highlight the health of how you as a leader or a father or a pastor exist with your family. And
Mhm.
the church was like a child to us. My wife has often used that analogy, like we gave birth to that child, so to speak. We were a midwife. God gave birth to it, but we were the vehicle by which he birthed it.
Mhm.
So there was a deep relationship, and so leaving it felt like we were leaving behind a child in some ways. Um, but again, I think that my greatest expression of what God has done for me, of what God has done for me through Jesus, is how I relate to my wife and my children. And I just cannot imagine living this life, having a limited amount of energy, creatively, practically, emotional, uh, mental, spiritual, and not giving that to the people that I am closest to.
Hmm.
Like I loved the parishioners. I love the parishioners of CCF. You know, even though I know not everybody loved me in the same way. Like I understand that, you know what I mean? But I loved the community that we built, and I loved giving myself as a pastor. It's also the way I'm wired. I feel like I'm more of a shepherd prophet more than I am a king. There's also, I will say right on the front end for anybody watching this, I lacked a lot of administrative things that I had to hire for, right? So, like, I am not the administrative type, I'm not the logistical type. And a lot of the decisions that we made were influenced by logistics and administration. That's very clear. I'm very vulnerable and honest about that. I am wired to be with people. I'm wired to listen. I'm wired to give counsel. I'm wired to preach. I'm wired to like shepherd and take that on. But as much as I love the people, and I said this several times, even from the front over the years of CCF, like, please don't ever make me choose between you and my family because you will always lose.
Yeah.
You will always lose. I will never choose the church over my family. And I don't think I ever felt tempted to choose the church over my family. And the moment that I realized that my energies, mentally, emotionally, and practically, were starting to feel stretched is the moment that I consulted the Lord. I'm like, yo, are you saying something here?
Mhm.
And in the, in prayer and in counsel, I realized, yeah, it's time to go. It's time to go because I want to I want to give my first fruits of in every dimension of what that means to my wife so that my kids and my wife in the end, whatever the end is, whether it's my end or the end of all that we know, uh, will say, "Nah, Rich gave everything he had to a lot of people, but he first gave it to us."
Hmm.
And I don't ever want my kids to say, Bobby wasn't around, or Bobby didn't help me think through this, or Bobby didn't offer his vulnerability first with us, or Bobby, was just not there. And practically that becomes hard. You got to work, you got to do, you got to move, you have your own dreams, things you want to do. All of that is a challenge. But if I can live as open and as vulnerable and as willing to invite my family into this thing that I call the journey with Jesus, then I'm going to do that first with them before I do that with anyone else. And in the end, my hope is that they would say, yeah, he gave that to us first before he
Yeah.
offered it to anyone else. And um, that's really hard, you know? So,
That's good, man. That's
yeah.
good. I need to hear that, honestly. Um, yeah. I won't even go into detail, but I need to hear that. And I think there are a lot of planters, pastors, leaders, even outside of ministry who need to hear that. Um,
People
yeah.
will be impacted. Yo, people will be impacted. And I don't believe that I believed or knew this when I first planted. But people will be impacted. I believe that people will be impacted far more by your energies being creatively, emotionally, spiritually, relationally being exhausted with your family
Mm.
more than with your church.
Yeah.
And
Amen.
this is not to say that we shouldn't plant churches. I believe in planting churches. I believe, obviously, in the role of pastors. I think that we need healthy churches.
Yeah.
But as we talk about the roles of the role of pastors, individuals that feel called to this, man, I promise you, if you love your wife, if you love your children, or if you're not married, if you love people, and you are present with them and you learn to listen well and you learn not to just to listen to the people but learn to listen to culture and learn to listen to God fundamentally, that will have such unimaginable dividends than you exhausting yourself and planting a church and putting things on the altar that God never invited you to. people will leave much more impacted
Yeah.
because you lived an honest, vulnerable life of integrity
Yeah.
uh, with the people that are closest to you.
Man, I feel like we could talk forever, bro. Like this
Same,
is
same.
it's a good conversation, man. We usually keep it around an hour. We're a little bit over that.
Yeah,
So I do want to spend just a little bit of time talking to you about what's going on now. So you made that
yeah,
transition and you all not just closed the church down. You mentioned this before, but you relocated, you left New York, this place of familiarity and you're connected to your identity and all of that stuff. And now you're like in a whole new place, right?
yeah,
And you're in Atlanta. Not a word, but a picture came up to me a couple seconds ago. I was like, man, he's kind of like somewhere between LeBron James and Abraham, right? It's like,
that's
guys like, hey, leave Earth. And, people like, oh, Earth? Yeah, leave. That makes sense. Like Earth was a really good place. Like y'all should do some history. Like Earth was pretty cool.
yeah,
And
yeah.
he's like, nah, I'm just gonna go. And I know that you had giftings, right? But and correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if you knew exactly what you were going to do, right? So like what does this season look like with you walking away from New York and pastoring and all of the things that come with that into the space in Atlanta?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll start off by saying there's a ton of ambiguity in my transition and what I was going to be doing. I knew that I wasn't going to be pastoring anymore, but that I still wanted to retain some of the things that I really enjoyed about that season of life, which was preaching and communication, particularly. Like I just didn't want I didn't at the time want any longer to carry the burden of shepherding a congregation and being responsible for them. I thought that my time contributing to the kingdom of God that way was done. But I still wanted to use my gift of communication and preaching, particularly. But how that was going to translate, I was kind of unclear. And it wasn't until I started to have more conversation and Atlanta started to become a more real thing that I went back to this thing that I used to love. I mean, I studied my undergrad was film theory and film production, so I had an idea about film, and I thought that I would always be in front or behind the camera in some ways, and then ministry happened and all that stuff. So film didn't come out of nowhere. Film was always a part of my life, my teenage years, college years for sure, as I studied it. Um, but when I knew that I was going to transition and I was no longer going to pass, I said, yo, can I pick this back up? You know, and my wife was incredibly supportive. The community, very close community around me was very supportive. And so when we moved to Atlanta, I said, hey, I think I'm going to go head on into this. And I was grateful for the season of life we were in that kind of gave me the space financially and mentally to really try, take my shot and not feel like the huge burden of trying something new at 37. You know what I mean? There was some mental, emotional, psychological things that I dealt with, like, yo, imposter syndrome. Like, what am I doing? Why
Mhm.
am I changing careers this late or what I thought was this late in my life? Um, but at any rate, fast forward. Yeah, I've been doing filmmaking for the last 3 years since I've transitioned. I bought a camera, started doing work on my own, anything from real estate, interview testimonials to nonprofit work. Anybody that would let me do anything, I just did it, and I felt like a little kid because I'm like, oh man, I feel like entry level. Like I could easily just go to a church pastor and feel not entry level because I've been doing it for 20 years, but I didn't want that. And so I dealt with a lot of insecurity. Uh, I didn't see the through line between what I did and what I was now exploring. And the last 3 years has been a lot of reflection, a lot of prayer, a lot of trying, a lot of failing, and a lot of discovering. Like, oh no, what I do or what I did as a pastor for all those years is showing up in what I do now as a storyteller.
Mhm.
Everything was about narrative, storytelling, creating this world, as you said, painting this picture, whether I was preaching a sermon, teaching a baptism class, leading a outreach service, drafting a script, filming a short, like all of it is about what do I believe and how will that express itself into the world? And as the earlier I started to find that through line between what I did and what I wanted to do, the more confident I felt in filmmaking, in this new expression of my gifts. And shooting the short film with my son, a script that I wrote, doing that with him back in December, working on this other script, taking someone else's ideas and making them into a world. I just felt more and more confident. This is what I'm supposed to be doing, at least for this next season of life. I mean, I want to believe that this is what I'll do. This is what will take me into the kingdom. Um, but I feel really good about what I'm doing. I've been doing what I want to do ideally is more narrative work. I
Mm.
want to make movies.
Yeah.
And I have my philosophy about how people of faith should be telling stories and making movies. Um, I don't like the way that people of faith,
So
particularly Christians,
Kevin Sorbo is not going to be in any of your movies, I'm guessing,
I'm
or
sorry.
Candice Beret.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Kevin and Candace. Y'all are just, I mean, look, respect to y'all, keep doing what y'all doing, kind of, but I'm just not gonna do it that way.
Yeah.
So, um, I think a lot of my experience as a pastor, my studies, my curiosity, my love for culture, has in many respects shaped my theology of creativity and my
Mm-hmm.
theology of filmmaking, if I can say it that way. Like I just I see artistry in, I don't think it's a unique way, but it is a particular way, and that's how I want to create. And I can see myself telling stories, for the long haul that I think will challenge both the culture outside of Christian faith, but also the Christian faith itself. I think that I want to. I have this philosophy, particularly around filmmaking, but artistry in general, and I'll kind of close my thoughts on this with this. Um, I don't want to use my art or my films to declare faith. I want to use my art and film to explore faith,
Yeah.
because I think that um, sets a radically different tone to your art and the viewers engaging with your art. I don't want my artistry, while I have my convictions about God and the world and the way that I should exist in them and the way that I think Christians should exist in them, I don't want my art to be declarative.
Mm.
Like, here's what Christian faith is. But rather, how can I use my art, particularly films, to explore what Christian faith is
Yeah.
and show the dark and messy ways that we engage with our faith. I think that's far more compelling. I think that offers a far more compelling invitation to viewers. Uh, it disarms viewers rather than um, dispels viewers. Like, oh, you're just telling me what to think about Christian faith, as
Mm-hmm.
opposed to inviting me to explore what it can be, what it hasn't been, what it should be. Like, I think that there's more power in that. All that to say, filmmaking has been an incredible journey. I'm thankful to the Lord for the doors that He's opened, the doors that are seemingly opening. I also work with John with Christianity Today. I don't say that as a sidebar. I really love what I do there. Um, and the reason why I love it is because I get the opportunity to focus on content that we develop, particularly for pastoral development.
Mm-hmm.
So any resources that we develop as it relates to pastoral ministry and pastoral formation, I'm responsible to think up and strategize production for. So, particularly as it relates to video content, I've only been there for a few months and it's been fantastic. But it's given me also opportunity to kind of meld my worlds together, my love for the creative arts, and my experience as a pastor. I'm able to kind of put those things together and create some really cool things. And I'm very thankful for that.
I love it. I love it, man. Dog, I've been on your website several times. So I've seen a good amount of your work, and you curate your Instagram very well.
Thank you, bro.
So I'm thoroughly impressed. I'm looking forward to seeing like all that you had the opportunity to do. I mean, you being able to work with your son and do stuff with your son, and then you and John have produced some really good stuff as well. And you're on tour. You go on tour with him, right? Like
Yeah, 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 yep.
as Jono was doing the We Go On, you're a huge part of that, and it's encouraging, man. Just to creatives who feel like you have to do certain things in a certain way to be able to just
Mhm.
push yourself creatively, and that's not true. And there's also like there's this counterculture of church creatives that are like holding picket signs like stop trying to make me fit into the box, and you're not that either.
Uh,
You're just saying like, hey, I'm just authentically me, and all I know how to do is um produce out of what's in me, right? So I appreciate you,
mm.
and I want to thank you for that, because we need that in the culture, man. um to wrap up, man, I always ask like two or three just really short questions just to kind of wrap up on a lighter note, even though this has been a great conversation. And I will go ahead and declare, just like I did with John, we got to do a part two because there's a lot of other stuff I didn't even get to ask you. But man, as you are now in this filmmaking space, I know this is like a corny question to ask, but what's your favorite film?
Oh my gosh. So I often get asked this question, and I think this is a great question, but I'll caveat it with I think the better question is what movie do I not mind watching over and over?
Right.
Because picking my greatest film is like, oh my gosh, I can't even have so much
Not greatest, favorite, right?
favorite,
So
favorite.
the greatest rapper of all time to me is Jay-Z, but my favorite rapper of all time is Mace. So it's a completely different thing, right? Uh,
Mates.
yeah, yeah. We can talk about that.
Oh wow, that's crazy. All right, so
Yeah.
I'll give two answers. But my favorite, I'm gonna give you oh, I guess so. Look, I'm gonna give you the one that I have been saying for a very long time. Because I really, really enjoyed watching this film. I think in the moment that I saw it, it was great. Titanic. I actually really enjoyed Titanic.
Really?
I watched it and it changed a lot of the way that I thought about good storytelling, and I just also love stories. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? Like I really love love stories. It was a kind of rom dramedy ish kind of thing.
yeah,
Plus, it also changed the way that people did filmmaking. James Cameron did something really big.
yeah.
But I also love Parasite. I love
Okay.
Parasite. And that's one of the newer ones, but I thought that movie was unbelievable storytelling. They did an
Hmm.
incredible job all the way through. Probably more than any other movie I've watched.
Yeah.
So I love
Awesome.
Parasite.
I love it. I love it. All right, here's the second question. You have also introduced me to a world of different um Latinx pastors, Latino pastors,
Yeah.
church leaders. Can you give me a couple that everybody needs to know? Everybody needs to either know or read or any of that.
Yeah. Jose Humphreys in New York City. Um, he wrote I keep forgetting the name of the book. It's Jesus in East Harlem.
Hmm.
Incredible dude. He and I have a great relationship. He's somewhat of a mentor. But he also just put out a book called The Economy of Jubilee. Um,
Mm.
I just love anything Jose says and does. I admire him a ton. He also planted in New York around the same time we did actually, but he's a bit older than I am. Justo Gonzalez, somebody that I really love and respect over the years. He was my introduction to new paradigms and rubrics of thinking about theology. As I think about my world, Giuliani Gonzalez, she's a teacher at TED. She's incredible. I think that she thinks very deeply about her Latinx identity and how it intersects with her faith, social justice. She's incredible. Elizondo, Virgilio Elizondo. He was a Catholic priest, taught at Notre Dame for many years before he passed away. I
Hmm.
think he's a great read scholar. Gosh, I know I'm forgetting a ton, but those are some that I think are incredibly important.
Love it. Hope everybody took notes. I'll
Yeah,
be on Amazon today. Um,
yeah.
two more. New York's one of my favorite cities. I remember the first time I ever went there, I was blown away. I'm from North Carolina, so like going to New
Okay.
York from North Carolina, you like, like
Yeah,
what
you
is
probably
going
think
on? Yeah. Man, we are planning a trip. Actually, my family's planning a trip. We're doing the whole like kids can pick wherever they want to go at 13. And one of my children is already like New York, New York, New York. She wants to be on Broadway and all that stuff. Man, if we're up there and we stop in Uptown, where do I need to eat? Where do I need to go? Give me at least one place.
Malecon Restaurant. It's on 175th and Broadway. You cannot go uptown and not eat in this place. It is staple, standard Dominican food. I mean, I'm talking about all the fixings like rice, beans, rotisserie chicken is what they're known for. You can't go there asking for a Cuban sandwich. You gotta eat rotisserie chicken because that's what
Yeah.
they do. Avocado, white rice, red and black beans. I mean, anything else outside of that is fantastic, but that's what you gotta go eat. Um, they just opened up a restaurant in that neighborhood. It's a chain. It's called Flor de Mayo. It's where my wife and I first went to eat Peruvian food together. I believe that was the first place. But my wife is Peruvian and Puerto Rican. We absolutely love Peruvian food. Flor de Mayo is somewhere you got to go eat. They're known for their dish called lomo saltado, which
Mm.
is steak strips, New York steak strips, uh, French fries, tomatoes, onions, cilantro, all sauteed together, draped over white rice. It's unbelievable. It's unbelievable food.
I love it. I love it. Last question, and then I'll give you some space if you want to ask any questions. You got any last comments? How in the world are you friends with John O. and he says that there's no good pizza in New York?
Oh man. Yeah, I pick my fights. I pick my fights. I'm also, as much of a New Yorker I am, um, I am not so bothered by people that don't like New York City things that I love, like
Mm.
pizza, because all I need is for me to love it.
Okay.
I don't need anybody else to love it. Like you won't dissuade me with your opinion. And if you don't like something that I deeply love that I think is good for society, like New York City pizza, it's cool. I
Yeah.
ain't sweating it. Like, oh man, you don't like it. You just missing out. And that's all right. Um, but nah, that's not something I'm gonna, pitch my tent in, like I'm good. If you don't like it, you don't like it. I know it's good. I'm also loyal to like local New York City pizza.
Yeah.
So, my neighborhood has, Johnny's Pizza. I'm sure John has never had Johnny's Pizza, which is why he says what he says.
Yeah.
Um, if he were to have Johnny's Pizza, he might change his mind. I think Johnny's Pizza is unbelievable, especially the chicken slice.
Yeah.
So
I love it. I
yeah,
love it. Rich Perez, man, I appreciate you, brother.
my
Uh,
dog. Appreciate
one
you,
day,
man.
one day, whenever you're shooting a big film, like let me run grips or something, like
Hey, hey, man, listen.
I could do a couple things, man. But in all seriousness, man, you have been even though we've only like had a few conversations and only been an acquaintance for a few years, like, man, you've been an inspiration to me because I do very much see a lot of similarities in just how you are made and your personality and the things you're attracted to and the gifts that you have. And much of your story has just been really encouraging to me. I mentioned it before, just like you being a creative, you being a storyteller, you prioritizing the legacy that's going to be built from your love for your family, and then just the freedom to be able to say, hey, I am walking this thing out in faith, and it doesn't have to be super Christianized CBN type material. It's me being my authentic self. So again, man, I just want to say I appreciate you for that.
Dog, I appreciate you saying that. I don't take those words lightly. I don't take that encouragement for granted. It's fuel for the journey. So thank you, man.
Oh, all good, man. Well, this is it's actually episode 8. It's supposed to be episode 9. I messed up last week. We didn't have an interview last week. If you're watching and you enjoyed this interview, I would suggest you go and watch some other interviews. And I also want to make sure that you stop by Story 11 Films, see some of the stuff that Rich is putting together, all the films that he's producing and filming and all that stuff. Mikasa Uptown is still one of my favorite books for church planters, especially those people who are planting in areas that they deeply, deeply love. And although there might be some extra chapters that need to be added to the book now, man, go download the book, pick it up, order it, whatever, man. That is our interview with Rich Perez. And I just want to remind everybody, as you're living this authentic life and you are trying to follow the path that God has you on, continue to live all of your life in Jesus Christ. God bless.